Do you like my setup? My bed. I tried to think of so many different places to film this in my room that made sense lighting wise, and this obviously doesn't necessarily make sense lighting wise, but I kind of liked the cozy, chill conversation vibe that this brings, except this is really shaky. I need to fix that. So I was recently inspired by one of my classes called Feminist Theory, where we have been talking about the discussion of what exactly feminist theory even is, and what gets to define that, and what sorts of literature and what sorts of stories have defined that, and what we know as what feminism is today. In our Western, being in America for me, in my Western culture, how I define what feminism is. This video is obviously very much opinionated. I don't want to say these, this is supposed to be more of a discussion video. I'm throwing my opinion at you. I am throwing text at you to back up my opinion in the perspective that Black women have transformed feminism and what it means to be what is a so-called feminist through their writing over the years, that have not necessarily been as acknowledged as some of our white feminist writers, or just like academic feminist writers. So yeah, I'm gonna get into it. I'm gonna take a drink of water and then we'll get right into it. What do you think of when you think of feminism? Do you envision women liberation, women protests, 1950s and 60s women, 1940s women, housewives? Do you think of free the nips? Do you what do you think of? I think of everything basically along those lines. I think of freeing white women from the patriarchy. I specifically say white women because I myself have had a very biased perspective of what feminism is, and I don't necessarily think of Black or brown women in the term feminism than I do in like another way. Like I think of them like free the oppressed women, if that makes sense. They feel like a different category of women in my own biases that I've noticed after taking this class, and reading the text that we've had to read for this class. A trend of bell hooks and Toni Morrison has become quite popular among young women readers. We've finally reached an age where Toni Morrison aesthetic is a trending search on Pinterest. I'm going to focus more on Toni Morrison in this video and other authors. I've only read Theory as a Liberatory Practice, I believe, by bell hooks. I have not read enough of her other books to talk about her. Her writing is not just for the academic level. They're meant to be for the public to read, which is what feminist theory should be all about. I'd like to bring to light that Toni Morrison seems to have a particular hold on her audience. She has Black and brown characters or women in the forefront in her writing. I think that's important to have Black women as a Black woman showcased on the front line in your writing. In a 1993 interview with Charlie Rose, Toni Morrison stated that, quote, white people have a very serious problem.
Which brings me to my question to you. Do you still have that encounter? Do you, Toni Morrison, Pulitzer Prize winner, successful, honored in the halls of academe, etc., still have that encounter?
Yes, I do, Charlie, but let me tell you, that's the wrong question. How do you feel? Not you, Charlie Rose, right. But don't you understand that the people who do this thing, who practice racism, right, are bereft? There is something distorted about the psyche. If you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And my feeling is white people have a very, very serious problem.
By her quote, white people have a serious problem, she's referring to ethnocentrism, this idea that it seems white Western feminism is based around. It seems like that concept is pretty mainstream in white Western feminism. Texts surrounding women's rights were an academic level. They were textual. They were, they were only for people who had an education to read them. And that's not necessarily how all women have been throughout the years of feminism coming into, ever since Mary Wollstonecraft, the vindication of the rights of women. What women were reading and writing at that time, like not many, and they were probably privileged and white. So because black and brown women were not reading or writing at that time, there was already immediately an absence of diverse writers in the feminist community that was developing. For example, where have the writers been, such as Gloria Anzaldua, whose book Borderlands/Frontera is written in half English, half Spanish, forcing women readers or feminist readers to see another language. You know what I mean? Everything's in English. Everybody always learns English. What about Hortense Spillers and Mama's Baby Papa's Maybe? Mama's Baby Papa's Maybe, where she dove right into slavery, the brutal details of and animalistic ways of slavery for women. Spillers' overall argument was about the concept of gender within slavery, and writes that if the point is that historic conditions of African American women might be read as an unprecedented occasion in the national context, then gender and the arrangements of gender are both crucial and evasive. She adds a quote from Linda Brent about slavery, quote, "Women are considered of no value unless they continually increase their owner's stock. They were put on par with animals. We do not read birth in this instance as a reproduction of mothering precisely because the female, like the male, has been robbed of the parental right, the parental function." Is that like a different branch of feminism? Like, or is that a different level of feminism? Like those women, and I think of Chandra Mohanty, who specifically wrote Under Western Eyes, which is a more academic and dense read. My thought here is, I certainly have not thought of the adversity of feminism that includes women of color writers, but their experiences cannot be undermined in the eyes of feminism, and I think they have defined it in a completely different way. One of Morrison's most famous quotes are, "If there is a book you really want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, you must write it." And one of the writers listed as Morrison's inspiration, according to Google, is Zora Neale Hurston, whose most well-known but still very unknown work was Their Eyes Were Watching God. The book was written in the Southern dialect of the African American community, following the story of Janie Crawford, a brown woman trying to navigate life in the American 1930s, struggling through 3 marriages and finding herself. The dialect, however, makes the text a very difficult read for those who are unfamiliar with it, hence its unpopularity and maybe surrounding senses of fear. Western feminism tends to shy away from perspectives that are not mainstream, easy or traditional English, easy to follow. But black women are certainly part of the ideology of feminism. Hurston's writing may have been difficult for the majority of educated, non-dialect speakers to understand. But nevertheless, it is a text that centralized black and brown people, namely even women, in the South, which was unheard of in the 30s. So when Morrison said, if there's a book you really want to read but it doesn't exist, you have to write it, she wrote her first book, The Bluest Eye, is literally about, from what I remember, from what I took from it, a young brown girl growing up in white Western beauty standards, hating herself, wishing she had blue eyes. I think she like prayed for blue eyes or something like that. I feel like that is an experience that most brown people in America face. They're like, oh, like wish I had lighter eyes. I would do like anything to look a little bit more Caucasian. And because this young girl grew up hating herself, there's a line in the book like she had a baby and the baby was black, and she was like, I finally gave birth to this baby, but it was an ugly baby. Continues this cycle of not only just internalized racism, but colorism, I guess. But it kind of just reminds me more of the patriarchy and how, like, we are, at the end of the day, something that Mohanty mentions is that at the end of the day, we are still uniting over, like, oppression from men. We are still uniting over, like, beauty standards that aren't being met. Who made those beauty standards? Women? I don't think so. That spoke volumes to me. To focus specifically on the aspect of feminism and what defines feminism, I would like to argue that black women writers such as Morrison highlighted what feminism is supposed to look like. Pieces of adversity and resistance in practice, not necessarily just I support women's rights. And further, the emphasis on intersectionality persists within black women's writing, which is an aspect that white feminists may not have taken into consideration in their writing or have had to deal with. Slavery almost always comes to mind when discussing black history. And in an interview, Morrison said that she actually wanted to avoid writing about it because she feels like she'd be undermining the experience. But then said that if they could live it, she could write about it. And she wrote Beloved, based on the true story of Margaret Garner. One of my top recommended books by her, by the way. But there's a writer who dove deep into the nauseating details of slavery while empowering black women who were living it. Angela Davis published Reflections on the Black Woman's Role in the Community of Slaves about 8 years before Beloved in 1972. She tackles the stereotype of the black matriarch that rooted itself into slavery. A modern example that comes to mind of this black matriarch figure is the Aunt Jemima's pancake mix. I don't know if that got canceled or something, but it still existed. A historical example would be black women taking care of white women's babies for them, their nanny. But this matriarchal role was not chosen by black women. It was a piece of slavery that held the community together. Cooking meals, working with the men, appeasing the slave master, and more gruesomely, birthing their master's baby and potentially never seeing it again. And further, black women have had to face the ideology that they are not feminine due to how much work they had been through. Or maybe just because they just didn't look dainty? Angela Davis writes, as her biological destiny, the woman bore the fruits of procreation. As her social destiny, she cooked, sewed, washed, cleaned house, raised the children. Traditionally, the labor of females, domestic work, is supposed to complement and confirm their inferiority. But with the black slave woman, there is a strange twist of affairs. In the infinite anguish of ministering to the needs of the men and children around her, who were not necessarily members of her immediate family, she was performing the only labor of the slave community, which could not be directly and immediately claimed by the oppressor. Domestic labor was the only meaningful labor for the slave community as a whole. Think of being born a woman, realizing you're a woman of color, and then questioning your femininity and womanhood. I think most people are familiar with Soujourner Truth's depiction of this feeling in her speech, Ain't I a Woman?, given in 1851 at a women's convention in Ohio. She describes what it feels like to be a black woman, but not quite fit the women role or appearance. So a main reason I believe that black women transform feminism is that I think it's fair to say that white women haven't had to deal with as much competition among themselves as black women have had to deal with. Dark-skinned women have wondered what it would be like to be lighter. Light-skinned women have wondered what it would be like to be lighter. Having multiple pieces of your identity be a minority is a bigger struggle. Brown and black women therefore have created a different sense of feminism, supporting oneself and supporting each other, lifting up all women. In their struggles, black and brown women have learned that it doesn't matter what shade you are, at the end of the day, you are still a woman in a patriarchal society. If the general concept of feminism is to lift up women, why does it still sort of have a white, Western, patriarchal flair to it? In Audre Lorde's The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, she says it perfectly. She writes, as women, we have been taught to either ignore our differences or to view them as causes for separation and suspicion rather than as forces for change. Without community, there is no liberation. Those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support. That's my whole thesis for this video. Like, that is it. She said it perfectly. What Black women writers brought to the forefront is the lack of diversity in white Western feminist culture. Toni Morrison, Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, Zora Hurston specifically created literature that was digestible for any audience, rather than a privileged white educated audience. In contrast, I think of Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a great articulated, very early feminist writer, but she was educated and white, so her writing of Vindication of the Rights of Women, which was originally from 1792, so clearly there was no indication of including all different shades of women in her writing, or considering those who could barely even read at that time. Along with making their texts readable, they made life through brown and black eyes easier to understand, which seems to be the most intimidating step when trying to sympathize and resonate with people who are dissimilar to you. Understanding. I think that overall the various black and brown women I have mentioned knew that the only way to establish any sort of liberation among women and create a more meaningful sense of feminism, we would need to acknowledge, understand, and appreciate our differences as women. I enjoyed putting this video together. I enjoyed getting the clips. I enjoyed writing the script. I enjoyed reading the text for my class. I'm going to link all of them down below in the description if you're interested in reading any of them. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Keep reading, keep learning, keep reading black feminism. Don't be biased like me. Don't have the idea that feminism is a little ethnocentric. There is struggle in feminism. There are struggle stories. It's not all about just being liberated from the kitchen. It might be liberated from the plantation or wherever. Read some text in a different language. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed my very professional setup of me in my bed and my black woman up here for support. And that's it. Bye.